Well, I'm looking forward to this session very much. I'm Russ Osguthorpe. I've been asked to moderate this panel on faith and learning in the classroom. I'm looking forward to it because I think we're going to get some fairly specific kinds of things, get down to very doable things that we can look at and consider in the classroom. Maybe we won't. I mean, maybe you're just going to stay at the high level. I don't know. I remember one time Jim Faulkner came over and did a seminar for us in the School of Ed, and somebody at the end raised a hand and said, "So Jim, what implications does this have for what we should do?" And he said, "Don't ask a philosopher that." He said, "That's not a philosophical question." But now, I think we are going to get into some of these more practical kinds of application kinds of things. So we have Jeff Barrow. I wonder if we could just ask Jeff and Michael and Craig and Ryan to just briefly introduce yourselves, and then we'll turn some time to you to talk for a minute.
I'm Jeff Barrow. I'm from the Department of Physiology and Developmental Biology. I received my undergraduate education here at BYU. I won't say how long ago. From here, I went on to the University of Utah, where I earned my PhD, working with a man whose name is Mario Capecchi, who incidentally won the Nobel Prize a couple of years ago. No thanks to me, I'll assure you that. But he had developed some very fascinating technology that's really revolutionized the world. And I was fortunate to work in his lab during a very exciting time, although it was in its infancy, and it probably resulted in me spending the 9 years that I ended up spending there, just because not all the kinks had been worked out yet. From there, I did my postdoc at Harvard University, and then came here to BYU, where I teach courses in developmental biology, which is essentially trying to understand how genes regulate what happens during embryonic development. That's kind of the easiest way, I think, to describe it. I teach courses that are, and this will come out later as we talk a little bit about incorporating faith and some of the things that I do, but I teach 400 and 500 level classes, so my classes tend to be a little bit smaller at that level.
I'm Michael Kelly. I'm in the Department of Germanic and Slavic languages. I, for the most part, teach Russian literature, primarily 19th century Russian literature. All of my research is centered on some of the great classic writers of the Russian tradition, Gogol, Dostoevsky, and Tolstoy. In addition, I, on occasion, get a chance to teach a Russian language class, which is a real treat.
My name is Craig Merrill. I'm in the large and roomy building over here. And I think Russ asked me to do this because he figured if someone from the School of Mammon can somehow apply religion or faith in the classroom, maybe anyone could do it. Trained at the Wharton School, where I received an extensive education in how to blow up world financial markets. I do study derivative securities, and I teach the topic of derivatives, the risk measurement and modeling and valuation for financial firms.
My name is Ryan Woodward, and I'm in visual arts and the animation area in particular. And I've been here at BYU for about 7 years now. And prior to coming here to BYU, I worked out at the animation studios and live action studios in LA on a number of fun films that keep me and my kids young and happy. I worked on the Spider-Man movies and the Iron Man movies and a bunch of others that date back to about 95 or so. And I'm happy to be here and learn something from these three guys right here.
Let me just say, I did not have anything to do with the composition of this panel, but I am excited about the composition of this panel.
Distance yourself now.
Nothing they say will be... Okay, the thing that's great about this is we've got somebody dealing with Spider-Man and finance and Russian and Tolstoy and science. We've got a very nice array of disciplines. One of the great things about a university is the diversity of discipline. This was mentioned in the last presentation when Ross said, it's hard to kind of relate some of this stuff to my discipline so much because my discipline, I can keep it fairly staid and fairly separate. And in other disciplines, it crosses over more. So the fact that we have professional schools in arts and humanities and sciences all represented here, I think is going to be very good for us today to talk about this diversity of disciplines and how we handle pedagogy and teaching in each one. So we will give a few minutes to each participant to talk to us about their approach, basically, really, is what they're hopefully going to do to this integration of faith and learning in the classroom. Okay, so Jeff, go ahead.
Okay. I don't know if this is going to be the right format at all, but I wanted to talk a little bit about some of my experiences that led to why I do what I do in the classroom. I am the first person in my family that's attended BYU, and the reason I wanted to come to BYU is that on my mission, just about everybody that I knew was going to BYU afterward, and I really loved the people that I served with on my mission, so I thought I really want to go back there. I'd really like to go to BYU. One of the things I inherited on my mission was a tape from Bruce R. McConkie called The 7 Deadly Heresies, and one of the deadly heresies is evolution, so I thought, you know, that was against church doctrine. And so I remember, to my great surprise, when I started having biology type courses, and when my professors would talk about evolution, I would think to myself, oh, they're one of those kinds of Mormons, off on the fringe. And I have to admit that after completing those courses, I still felt that they were those kinds of Mormons because they never, and I'm not going to criticize these individuals, but I guess it was kind of the silent soul era when I attended BYU, and I didn't really know how my professors felt spiritually. But I will say that I did have a genetics class, and one day my professor, Ralph Anderson, was up teaching, and he was stammering a little bit, and all of a sudden he said, could we all just join together and sing, Come Ye Children of the Lord? And we all stood, and he led us in that song just as though he were leading the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. It was very enthusiastic. It brought the Spirit in. And afterwards he said, thank you, I needed that. And through retrospect, as a student, as I thought about that experience, I needed that. I needed to know that my professor knew and had spiritual convictions. Another experience that I had that really motivates me in what I do in the classroom came when I was actually a postdoc. I attended a seminar for all postdocs that were on this particular fellowship. It was at the National Institutes of Health, and so they invite all the fellows in to give a talk about their research, but also to rub shoulders with 4 faculty that they also invited in. And one of these was a professor by the name of Dave McClay at Duke University. And he got up and told all of us fellows his perception of what it means to be a professor. And I was so inspired by what he said, I was back in the back of the room in tears because I just couldn't believe what I was hearing and what his perceptions were on what it means to be a professor. And he told, one of the things he mentioned in his talk was that he had trained 35 PhD students, and 34 of them are still in science. And I don't know what it's like in your disciplines, but I entered graduate school as a class of 25, and 3 of us are still in science. And so that's an incredible track record. And so afterwards I asked him, why or how did you manage to keep 34 people in science? And he answered my question with a question. He said, Jeff, when you're writing a paper, how many papers do you refer to from the 1990s? And this was in 2001. I said, well, quite a few times. He said, how many from the 1980s? I said, well, actually quite rarely, maybe 2 or 3. How about the 70s? I said, 0. 60s, 0. He said, the way I look at it, within 20 years, nobody's going to remember who Dave McClay was. But the way that I can really make a difference is to make sure that my students have a great experience. And I'll tell you just a little bit more about something I learned about Dave McClay a little bit later on. So those are kind of the two ideas that I want to kind of build upon. One is students really need to know that you love them. And then number two, they need to know that you know that the gospel is true. And so I just want to talk a little bit about what I do. And these are very specific things to the courses that I teach, and they won't be the same for you just because your circumstances are different. But I'm confident that if you're really prayerful and thoughtful about how you can incorporate these two principles, that you'll be able to come up with a way to do it. And so the first thing, letting students know that you care about them, you know, and how do you do that? And of course, it's kind of easier for me teaching 400 and 500 level classes because my courses are smaller. But one of the things I do is, and one of the things I love about BYU is that you get a little picture sheet with every student's name on it before you teach the course. And before the class starts, I learn everybody's name. And I love coming into class and just seeing the surprise on their face when I start asking them questions like, why is developmental biology such a hot topic today? Why do we find it in just about every hot research journal? And I'll get a hand come up and I'll say, yeah, Fred. And they'll look at me like, whoa, you know, I can't believe that he knows my name. And they often mention that in their student critiques of the classes, you know. He knew my name, and because he knew my name, you know, I wasn't even interested in development, but because he knew my name, I became interested in his topic. And I knew I needed to come to class prepared because he might call on me, and he might call on me by name. And another thing that's also fun is just, you know, when you're out in between classes, running into them and just saying, hey, George, how are you doing? And then maybe just asking them things about themselves, you know, where are you from? And, you know, I often have that opportunity outside the classroom to be able to talk, but just to show them my genuine interest in them. Another thing that I do is that I have an assignment that requires a lot of coaching, and so the students come into my classroom, into my office or into my lab, and I coach them in groups of 2, and I get to know them a lot better. And obviously, these are things that are not going to be possible for a course of 250 or more than that. But again, you can come up with your own way. Dave McClay, this guy from Duke University that I was telling you about, he teaches, I found this out from another individual at a meeting. I was telling this other individual how much Dave McClay had inspired me. And he said, you know what? This guy is incredible. At Duke, he teaches a course in cell biology that has 250 students. And what he does is he invites them in groups of 10 over to his house for a lasagna dinner. And he does this throughout the semester. And I'm not saying for you guys to do this. That sounds pretty staggering. But that is his vision. That's how he shows his students that he cares about them. And it makes a huge difference in students' lives. I think that students, of course they care about the course, they care about getting a good grade, but they care so much more when they know that you care about them. Okay, so those are some of the things that I do. And then how do I tell students, how do I share with them what I know to be true? Because as I mentioned, this was something that kind of troubled me as a student in biology, is that I didn't know how my professors felt about the gospel. And I find that the course that I teach just lends itself very nicely to this. In contrast to what Russ was mentioning this morning, that, you know, that sometimes it might be difficult. But I would still argue that Ralph Anderson, this professor that I had that was teaching how he just got up and sang a hymn with us, that meant loads to me. I can't tell you how much that memory means. That maybe there's still ways to do that, but I teach a course that lends itself so nicely to this, where we talk about evolution. And then I tell them my story about how I came to BYU thinking that evolution was against the doctrines of the church. And one thing I forgot to mention to you is that story did have a happy ending. I did have a professor who pulled me into his office and opened up the scriptures, talked to me about the temple, and talked to me about some historical events in the church's history that really helped me. I can't tell you how much that discussion helped me. So I tell them my story about evolution, and then I tell them, just in case you think that I'm one of these other kinds of, that I'm one of those kinds of Mormons, I want to just let you know that God lives. And every time I bear my testimony, I just feel the Spirit just rush in, and I often get emails saying, thank you for sharing that, your testimony with us. Other times, we talk about sexual development in my class, embryonic stem cells. These lead to very good discussion. So I actually, when we talk about these ethical sorts of issues, open it up to discussion. And these are some of the most spiritual discussion lectures that I'm able to have. But I will say that the vast majority of the time, I'm not necessarily bearing my testimony. I'm just teaching the course content, and I'm just hoping that something that I say, or perhaps the spirit that they might feel, helps them in some way. But my whole goal is that students know by the end of the course where I stand with my views toward the gospel. I think I took way too much time, and I apologize for that.
Thank you, Michael. I'll have you go in just 1 minute. Jeff reminded me of an experience I had when one of my sons was 18 years old, freshman, I was driving him to the university every day. On the way home one day, he said, so what have you been doing, Dad? I said, well, I was an associate dean, I think, at the time in the School of Ed, and we were trying to hire some people. And I said, we're having a hard time finding LDS people that are qualified in a certain particular discipline. And he said, well, why would that matter? He said, why would you want to hire LDS people? I said, well, this is, it is sponsored by the church. I thought, wow, you don't know this. And he said, I don't know why that would even be important. He said, I don't care if my professors are LDS. He said, I wouldn't know if all of them are atheists right now. I said, really? I said, you wouldn't know that right now, all of your professors? He said, I don't think so. He says, that one. He said, I think he's a member of the church. I knew myself, they were probably mostly all members of the church. And I thought, whoa, it wasn't obvious. It was not obvious to this freshman 18-year-old that he was being taught by members of the church. And so we had a little talk more about that. But I think things probably have changed since then. Yeah, okay.
As I already mentioned, my field is Russian literature. I freely acknowledge that from my perspective, Russian literature as a whole is intensely spiritual. Regardless of the degree of religiosity of the writers, they engage the big questions about the meaning of life, about the values that guide our decision-making, about important moral crises and dilemmas that we face. So I would say that in my field, the opportunity to integrate learning and faith is abundant, and the students readily recognize connections between what they're reading and gospel principles. But I'd like to share just 2 or 3 thoughts really quickly, probably more on the level of principles than specific practices, although this first one is a practice. And just in terms of terminology, I'm borrowing a phrase that I encountered in one of the articles in a book edited by the Jacobsens by a Jewish scholar, Lee Shulman, who was talking about the Jewish tradition of learning. And he indicated that in the Jewish tradition, you could never be content just focusing on the text itself, but that they felt an obligation to move from the hermeneutic to the homiletic. Or in other words, to move from analysis and interpretation to the question, so what are the moral and spiritual implications of what we're examining? And I try to let students know on the very first day of class every semester that I'd like them to consider that. And in fact, that in every literature course that I teach, there's either a written assignment or an oral presentation where I ask the students to answer the question, Therefore what? Having looked at these ideas, what are the moral and spiritual implications and ramifications of them? How has your life been changed? How have your values been challenged, perhaps modified? What have you come to understand differently about your relationship with other people, your relationship with God, and so on and so forth? I like to share with them two statements. One comes from the prophet Joseph Smith, and I have this in all of my syllabi, where he said, "Thy mind, O man, if thou wilt lead a soul unto salvation, must stretch as high as the utmost heavens and search into and contemplate the darkest abyss and the broad expanse of eternity." And just suggest that really, as students here at BYU, one of our tasks is to learn how to help lead ourselves and others unto salvation. And I also share with them from a Russian perspective a statement from the Russian philosopher and literary critic Bakhtin, who in one of his very early essays made the statement, "I have to answer with my own life for what I have experienced and understood in art, so that everything I have experienced and understood would not remain ineffectual in my life." So from the beginning of class, I just invite students to ponder that question. What is going to be the meaning of the ideas that we consider? How can I answer with my own life for the ideas and the understanding that I acquire? Well, just as a second thought, as soon as you invite students to be participants in a great dialogue with these wonderful writers, very quickly becomes apparent that engaging in dialogue, we encounter voices that are very foreign to us. And I don't mean foreign simply because of the language in which they're expressed, but foreign because of the manner in which they're expressed, or sometimes very foreign because of the ideas themselves that seem very contradictory, very much at odds with our own values and belief system. I was intrigued by the Jacobsens' discussion of this interaction between faith and learning and the four models that they talked about of conflictual and compatible and paradoxical and functional. I'm not sure that I've clearly defined in my own mind which one of those best fits my way of thinking about the world. I suppose it's more a dynamic interplay of all of them. But I think for me, something that transcends all of those is our relationship, not to the idea itself, but to the individual who expresses the idea, and that's stemming from our belief system, where we really believe that every individual is literally a spirit son or daughter of our Father in heaven, created in His image, is the need to value the individual regardless of what we think about the idea. If you'll bear with me, just a quick reference to Russian literature. Dostoevsky is one of my favorite writers, I suspect a writer that many of you are familiar with, one of the most intensely ideological of all writers. In fact, I think sometimes you could describe his novels as battlegrounds for opposing ideas. And one of Dostoevsky's primary ideological opponents, they were on polar opposites of most questions, was a man by the name of Chernyshevsky. I've been intrigued as I found what Dostoevsky wrote after he first actually sat down and visited with Chernyshevsky. He said, "He spent an hour with me, and I must confess that I rarely have met a kinder and more cordial person. Chernyshevsky's convictions never offended me. One can have a good deal of respect for a man, even when one has radically different opinions from him." And then I'm intrigued by a brief excerpt from the novel Crime and Punishment, one of my very favorite novels, where we have two characters speaking of a mutual acquaintance who has very different ideas than they do. And the one is very harsh in his assessment of this other character, but his friend then makes this very interesting comment to him. He said, "He ought to be drawn in and not pushed away. You won't set a person right by pushing him away. You disparage man and damage yourselves." And I suppose in terms of engaging in dialogue, that's one of the ideas that I try to share with my students. If we disparage the individual, we damage ourselves. It doesn't mean that we need to minimize or ignore differences. It doesn't mean that we can't engage in spirited dialogue as we set forth our ideas. But I found that if students nonetheless value all of the participants in the dialogue as individuals, that they are less fearful to engage in debate, that they come to the dialogue with a greater sense of humility, a greater sense of compassion, a greater feeling that they really have something meaningful to contribute. And then just very briefly, and this echoes what Jeff was saying, I think it's important as we value the participants in the dialogue that we are involved in our disciplines, that our students know how much we value them. I like to share with students, beginning of every semester, that they have distinct perspectives that they bring to the analysis of literary texts, that my perspective is broadened every time I teach a text because of the insights that students bring. A favorite talk of mine is from President Eyring that he gave at a university conference in 1991. This was before I ever came to BYU, but picked it up and read it. The title of it is "Teaching is a Moral Act." And in that article, he quotes one of his professors at the University of Harvard Business School, who wrote this statement in a book. "I believe in the unlimited potential of every student. At first glance, they range like instructors from mediocre to magnificent. But potential is invisible to the superficial gaze. It takes faith to discern it. But I have witnessed too many academic miracles to doubt its existence. I now view each student as material for a work of art. If I have faith, deep faith, in students' capacities for creativity and growth, how very much we can accomplish together. If, on the other hand, I fail to believe in that potential, my failure sows seeds of doubt. When this happens, everyone loses." And then President Eyring goes on to say, "Now may I simply say that I think he is right. Teaching is a moral act. Faith is indispensable to teaching. We hardly know the potential of our students, but we send them signals each time we doubt and each time we believe. If you really believe that they are children of God and that they are not that much below you because you also are a child of God, then when you are with them, they will feel it. They will get your signal, and you will do something for them that goes beyond what the world calls teaching. You will have performed a moral act that will last a lifetime and into eternity." Well, that is a statement that endlessly inspires me, and I suspect I fall far short, but that's the ideal that I strive for with my students.
Thank you, Michael. Craig, would you like to?
So I want to avoid saying, here's what I do, and instead share with you the perspective I've gained as the director of the MBA program. I have the opportunity semester after semester to watch some of the best faculty I've had the privilege of knowing and their impact on students and how they do what they do. You know, it's easy to take shots at the business school, and I'm willing to take shots at us too. But the reality is, I'm among some of the most faithful human beings I've met in my life. And the thing that is hopeful to me is that there's no one right way to do this. We have faculty who have instilled in our program the idea that every day should start with prayer. So we have a cohort-based program where a group of students will start the day in the same room together, and the faculty rotate through, not the students. And so they're in the room together for the full day, and we have a culture where every day starts with a prayer. And the students in the class will pray and invite the assistance of the Spirit and the learning that will take place that day. There are days where that may be the last overtly spiritual reference, and yet it sets the tone for the day. We have faculty who will come in and never say an explicit religious word, and yet because of, like Michael's been describing, and I thought it was beautiful, the language that was used, the way they treat the students is their testimony of the divinity of the individual. We have other faculty who, in the same breath, will say debit, credit, and shed tears as they talk about the Holy Spirit. Now, should I try to do that, the students would see right through it because I'm not a tearful person. On the other hand, there are ways that I can communicate the reality of my faith. And that's what I think is an important and a hopeful message, is what the students respond to is the reality that our faith is an integral part of who we are and how we face and interact with the world. So one of our stated learning outcomes for the program is that our students will leave the program with a greater appreciation of how their faith is relevant to their professional development. That's a hard one to measure. We get little hints from the student surveys where they tell you, was I inspired? Did I come away with in a stronger testimony? But we interview every student before they leave, and in those exit interviews, just about a month ago, I did 110 exit interviews. And what I heard over and over again is, yes, it's relevant. And the reason I believe it is I've been among a class and a faculty of some of the finest, most faithful people I've known, and they exhibit excellence in their profession and a passion about learning and performance. And I love that those things go together. And so in some ways, it's atmospheric more than technique. And that's hopeful to me, because now I don't have to solve it. I just have to be me and let me show. I love what Jeff said about, do they know by the end of the semester that I'm a man of faith? Well, I know one of our faculty uses this approach. First day of class, here's the syllabus, here's the requirements, this is going to be a difficult class. If you want an easy 3 hours, go somewhere else. But by the way, I understand where this fits in the grand scheme of things. Life is about bigger things. But I'm going to make sure by the end of the semester you've got a great toolkit in this discipline. And then on the last day of class, a reminder with a testimony. I understand where this fits, because here's my faith about what life is really about. And so it's a bookend approach. But there's no one right way to do this. Just a couple of comments on things that the Jacobsens pointed out in book and presentation. There's a comment in the book. Many Christians are just as unreflective about the ways their faith interacts with their scholarship as anyone else in the academy. So despite my pot shot at Sunday school, Russ, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
We do fall prey to not questioning what we think we know in the academy and in the Sunday school. Just one example. I struggled for years with the question of how can I teach or testify when I've not been called through priesthood authority to do so. And that very tension has caused me to re-examine what it means to be called. And it was a Presbyterian visiting faculty member who helped me to get this. He talked about a sense of calling in his faith, and how a sense of calling is confirmed by the joint belief of the individual who feels a sense of calling and the congregation who welcomes that call. And sometimes the congregation says you're no longer called. Sometimes we have to say no on promotion and tenure decisions. But there is a sense of a call being motivated from within. And I've now got a new perspective on priesthood callings. They're like training wheels. They're an assigned area to exhibit my faith, and an opportunity to learn to exhibit my faith in areas where I've not been assigned. And this job is one of those areas. Last, the Jacobsens talk about a one-way view of integration, which requires that Christian scholars temporarily become religious philosophers rather than biologists, economists, engineers, or artists. We sometimes think we know more than we really do know. My example with priesthood, I've got another friend, Steve Nadald, who looked at the question of agency and said, do we really know that much about agency? Yeah, we're free to make choices, but that's sort of the quick shoot from the hip answer. We have in Moses 7:32, the Lord said unto Enoch, behold these thy brethren, they are the workmanship of mine own hands, and I gave unto them their knowledge in the day I created them. And in the Garden of Eden I gave unto man his agency. Now hold it. I heard in Sunday school and in priesthood, so we'll bring them in as well. I heard in my seminary lessons that I had agency in the premortal existence. How did it get given in the Garden of Eden? And it's that kind of a question that doesn't shake faith. It's the opportunity to understand your faith better. And in the economic world, we have a whole body of literature on what's called the principal-agent problem, the relationship between principles and agents. And so Steve sat down and thought about just what does it mean to have agency and how could it be given in the garden when it already existed. And it was the economics literature that made for some of the best insights. And it helps us to decide what we do in the college because we stop and ask, who are the shareholders? Who are the customers? What is the product? So that what we do professionally is guided not only by the best thinking within the discipline, but also this idea that agency is a gospel principle, but maybe one that we're not done understanding yet. The point of this is the students want the same rigor of thought when we explicitly bring the gospel into the classroom. They want the same rigor of thought that they get from us in our academic disciplines. We come from some of the world's best schools. We're trained to think well. And they want to find out that that works in their religious lives as well as in their academic.
Thank you, Craig. Ryan?
I don't know about you guys, but I've certainly learned a few things already. I think it's kind of before I share some comments, I think it's important to just give you a little, just preface the mind of an artist or the students that I am involved with, and these are students that have a desire to create artwork. They create something. They create something that tells a story, or something that motivates or inspires. And that is such a strong desire in them that it overshadows, for the most part, it overshadows their desire to aspire to be, to be really wealthy, or to have a more prestigious career. But they want to create. But with that comes a risk, and they're scared to death. A lot of them. They're scared to death of how they could actually provide for their families. They're scared to death of, are they going to get in a situation where a client has asked them to create something that maybe compromises their standards? Or they're scared to death of jumping into a studio or a production that's going to take so much time and so much effort that it's going to take them time away from their family. And these are all questions that I know is in their mind. I know they're thinking these questions the first day I meet them. And I do have the privilege of having the same students in a number of classes, so I get to develop a fairly unique relationship with them. I spend a good 3 years with these individuals. And knowing that, it gives me a lot of comfort. Well, let me just say this: if I was somewhere else, if I was at a state university or a I even taught some classes when I was in LA for a while at a school out there, and I remember those questions come up, and I had to answer it carefully. I had to answer those questions, work hard, draw a lot, study some books, right? And I had to answer those questions in a very secular way. But I'm so grateful to be able to be here at BYU, where when those questions come up, I don't feel arrogant anymore. I don't feel like I have to answer them in a way that empowers myself. You know, because they'll ask me questions like, well, how do you learn to draw this, or how do you learn to draw that, and how come you draw so good? And I was always very uncomfortable because I felt arrogant in even answering that question. But at BYU, I get to sit before them and say, and really tell them why I feel like what the secret to success is, basically. Number one is live the gospel. If they live the gospel, then the Lord will guide their lives, no matter what career decision they decide to make. Even if they decide to leave the arts and go into something else, the Lord will guide them. And that eases a lot of their concerns. It raises even more. But I can share with them experiences of struggling myself as an artist, and trying to become better, and trying to get over some of these hurdles, and they respond to that. And I like to have an environment in the classroom where they can ask just about any question that comes across their mind, no matter how sensitive that question might be, no matter how internal that question might be. I mean, again, by nature, artists are very introspective, and so they're not very scared to ask these kinds of questions. And well, I guess I'll just kind of stop there, because I'm sure you guys all have a lot of questions too you probably want to ask in the panel. But overall, it's just sharing those kinds of experiences and faith-promoting experiences of my own, and helping them to understand their relationship with God and with the Savior, and how that influences not only their lives, but it influences them as artists and what they create. It motivates them to create good works, and it motivates them it just empowers them in what they do, and that's I guess that's the approach that I tend to gravitate to.
Thank you, Ryan. There's one theme that goes through all this, and Ryan ended it with understanding the fears of the students and what he needs to do to help them. But through all this, the other panelists, we have felt this relationship with the students. How do we form this relationship with the students that lets them know we care? I mean, this was kind of a very powerful way that I think we ended there, that if you understand who they are and what they are feeling and thinking, this really communicates care. Certainly, learning their names communicates care. All of these things that you've mentioned, it flowed through every one. So one question I have right now is, what other ways are you using right now to show students that you care about them as individuals, as human beings? Could I just hear some ways that you're doing this that maybe you haven't heard here? Are there other ways that you communicate this? Any ways? Yeah. Oops. Yes.
I have a different question though. But,
okay. Stand up. Yeah.
We are not just serving 100% faithful students, we're also serving students with doubts, students who have questions. And so I was wondering, is it enough if we just exercise or present ourselves as the 100% believers as examples in that. Can we also do something to address these students or to address this aspect of faith which contains doubt, questions, insecurity about religious questions? Mm-hmm. Is it not also our responsibility to include this in our role as spiritual leaders in the classroom?
Okay. Do you try and do that? Keep saying it.
Okay. How I do that, I'm still figuring it out.
Okay.
Because I'm still new, I don't know to what degree I can do this without being perceived by my own colleagues as undermining the church framework of the school. Yeah, but I always try to be as authentic as I can in my classroom to say, without addressing particular doubts I have, always addressing, I do have doubts about certain things, and I do have questions. And I'm trying to make sure to them they understand that that is a good thing, or at least it can be a good thing. Doubt is not simply just the influence of the devil in your life who tries to tear you away from the truth. Doubt can also be a pathway to greater understanding, to new understanding.
Okay. Okay.
And I've always felt students really welcome this approach.
Okay. Okay. Yes.
A distinction that I've kind of used with students is to encourage what I think of as faithful questioning. By faithful questioning, I don't mean that you already believe the pat answer you're supposed to believe, but that you believe, you trust that there is some answer that you can find here. And I try to teach students that when you're reading a text, or if you're reading scripture or something, and you come up to something that you say, huh? I don't get that. Why does it say this about agency given to us? It's a faithful question if you ask that, saying, I think there's a truth here I'm about to learn. And I tell them that you get a nose for that. You can begin to sense where those little moments are. But don't ask unfaithful questions, which is, I dare you to come up with an answer. I bet you can't come up with an answer. That's the wrong kind of spirit that I think is really alien from a scholarly kind of approach.
Good. Any comments from the panel? Yes, Craig?
So just one other, I think it's a wonderful question. We also have people who do not share our faith, but are strong in their faith. And I think that the things that both of you have talked about, we don't draw a line and say, I dare you to disagree with me. We don't talk in these absolutes. It's okay to say, here's what I believe, here's what I've come to know, here's how I live. One of my favorite comments in the exit interviews I mentioned was from a Hindu woman here from India. And I asked her about her faith in God and her experience. And she said, I came here as a Hindu who believed in God. I leave here a Hindu with a greater belief in God. And so it's the encouraging, the faithful questions. I like that paradigm.
Okay.
That seemed to work.
I think Alan gave a talk entitled that one time, quite faithful questions or something, right? Yeah. Lynette?
I just wanted to bring up, I think that I don't think that questioning and doubt are necessarily synonymous. And I think one of the things our students kind of get in the position of is not questioning because it would infer doubt, rather than us encouraging questioning and letting them know that questioning is not necessarily doubt. So as we do that, we need to help them to understand that questioning is good.
Good. Good. Yes, Steve?
I was thinking of a conversation I had with a student about 10 years ago, I guess both of your questions. We'd been talking about carbon-14 dating in a physical science 100 class, and she came to my office very distraught afterwards. One of the keys, I think, when I get students in my office, I can have a whole different kind of discussion than I can get in the classroom setting. And she said, I grew up in this little tiny Utah town, and my Sunday school teacher and everybody else were telling me how carbon-14 dating was so stupid and nobody in their right mind could possibly believe that, and how wrong it was. And now you just gave me a really convincing presentation about the solid background behind it. What am I supposed to do? I said, oh, I'm glad it worked. I'm glad you saw the empirical data. And she said, but you don't understand. These are the same people that were telling me that the Book of Mormon's true, and that God lives, and that He answers my prayers. And I thought, what a great chance this was. We really could talk about how she needed to know for herself. And she couldn't rely on other people's witnesses, how she needed to get her own witness to know what's true. And so I think, to get back to the point, if we can have these kind of conversations with students, what a shame it would have been if she had first encountered these questions in this crisis of faith at a place where she couldn't have this kind of discussion with somebody of faith, where she felt confidence in me as a disciple and me as a scholar, and we could talk about how those go together.
That's great. Elder Oak said one time, make sure that your faith is never hard to detect when we teach. Yeah.
In years of teaching Introduction to Philosophy, a common subject considered is the existence of God. And as I constructed an anthology to read, I would look for the strongest arguments I could find against the existence of God, so students would be aware of the strength of those positions, drawing typically from Hume. And I found that in the context of reading things which are very much contrary to one's religious beliefs, if they're done in a context in which the people engaged have alternative views, there is a real power simply in the modeling. We forget sometimes that university standards isn't just to keep us being nice to each other. It's also done to ensure that we're adequate models, because the power of modeling from teachers is very strong. I remember Peter Crawley asking him a question. I don't know how many of you still know him. I suppose he's retired, but 30 years ago, I asked him this question. He had come to BYU, to the math department from Caltech, and I asked him, Peter, how does one learn to do elegant proofs? Almost any student can learn to do a proof, but how do you learn to do them elegantly? And he said, if you study with a professor who did proofs elegantly, you will learn to do them. And there's nothing cognitive in this. If we speak out thinking so much of learning is word to ear to interpretation, but so much of it is modeling. And that's what we look for, in all the church schools, and even those that aren't, like Southern Virginia University, which endeavors to do similar kinds of things, but without church support. And I think we're seeing this increasingly need for this. I was an undergraduate at Brown, and it was founded by the Baptists 200 years before I entered. And the only residual influence is a weekly compulsory convocation the university chaplain held. But it was a place of freedom and where you could express religious ideas in the classroom. And I wrote a paper for a history professor on Joseph Smith's first vision. He wasn't very happy in the topic that I chose, thinking it too insignificant, but nonetheless was willing to assess the paper on professional historical standards. And I think that we need to think more in terms of how we model in our classrooms, because students do imitate. I remember the anger of a neighbor who attributes his daughter's apostasy to a bad model that he got in a church school.
Thank you.
Yes. I just wanted to add one thing to this gentleman's question. And in the particular class that I teach, we have several issues that come up where the church doesn't have an official stance, and therefore there isn't an answer. And I often ask the students, why do you think sometimes the church doesn't have a stance on prenatal genetic diagnoses or things like that? And ultimately, they come up with the answer that, we really need to do our own research so that we can learn, first of all, everything that there is to know about it, and then, take what we know to the Lord and come up with our own answer. And I think that applies to the comment that you brought, that sometimes, I don't necessarily know how the Lord feels about a particular issue, but I feel because he hasn't revealed that, then that's my responsibility, that I need to go out and figure out, learn everything I can about this particular topic, and then take it to the Lord and just say, this is how I feel about it after all my research. And already, there's students that have been faced with some of these difficult issues that we talk about with class that have done that and are able to testify to their classmates how they came to their conclusion. But it might not be the same one for somebody else.
Thank you, Jeff. Excellent. One comment that Craig made I'd like to come back to if I could. He said that they have a learning outcome. State that learning outcome again.
I'm going to have to paraphrase.
That's fine. Paraphrase. That's good.
We want every graduate of the MBA program to leave with a greater understanding of how their faith is relevant to their professional development.
So does this affect the way faculty teach, do you think, in any way?
I actually think it's an embodiment of what we already believe and want to have happen. In other words, we're documenting something good that's happening as opposed to trying to get people to do something that they wouldn't otherwise do.
Good. Alan mentioned yesterday that in looking at learning outcomes, and we'll come back to it in a sec, in the university, about, I think he said 2% or something of the learning outcomes have some kind of spiritual or religious overtone like this. Should there be more of those? I mean, should there be more outcomes like this that if this really embodies it, then should we show that to the students that we're actually trying to do that because students can look at these outcomes? I don't know. I would like to hear. Yeah.
I think it's hard to measure because what I've gathered today is nothing cognitive. It's modeling or it's not about atmosphere. It's how you treat the individual.
Yeah, and so I'm not talking about measuring. I'm talking about should the goal be there, stated.
Well,
the learning outcome is just a goal. Should that goal be stated like that or not, Russ?
When we got pushed to build learning outcomes,
yeah,
the emphasis on measuring was very strong.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of us just.
So maybe we avoided that because.
Yeah, we did.
Okay, because we said we can't measure it. Okay, because we can't close the loop if we don't.
Right.
Okay. All right. Yeah.
Well, I wanted to comment on the fact that in these learning outcomes, the outcomes apply to the university education and within the limited discipline of my field, which is musical performance. We have courses that are designed to make those musicians performing successful musicians. But there are other elements of their education that are devoted to their spiritual development. We have no control over the curriculum that goes into those classes. We presume and we hope that those classes will have their own learning outcomes designed to touch their faith. But I think it's a little bit presumptuous on our part to try to spell those things out when our part of the task is to train the people in the specific disciplines when we have as part of a larger context of a general education.
Okay. This is interesting to me. I mean, because you actually did, speaking of measurement, you actually do measure that in a way by exit interviews. That's one measure, indirect
We
measure.
have some hints. I wouldn't call them full-on measures.
Right. But you actually ask students about that, right, to see. Yeah. So these are some, anyway, this is an interesting thing to think about. Yeah.
One of the things that I do, I also teach in the Merrill school, and we did take that, I took that learning outcomes in one of my courses, and I did make assignments. So for example, I assigned several readings. One of them is Elder Oak's talk on the challenge to become.
Right.
And I asked specific questions that they are then to respond to in a journal type format, where I ask them to draw connections between what they read in that, I take specific quotes out of that, and connect that to how they believe that will impact their activity as a business professional once they leave the university. And so I have changed the way I teach to try to address that issue in some ways.
Can we all just pause for a moment and appreciate that a learning outcome changed a behavior? Wow.
Spurious effect. Yeah. Just come back to the measurement thing for just a minute, too, because sometimes you were measuring, right? I think you were measuring, actually. Sometimes we define measurement only as quantitative. Has to be quantitative, has to be percent of this or percent of that, or it doesn't necessarily have to be. In this way, I mean, this could end up a percent. This percent of students said that they felt that this learning outcome was met or whatever. So there's lots of ways to look at measurement that are not sometimes the typical narrow definition of that. So anyway, this is all interesting, and you've tried to get at that through journal. Yeah, Russ?
Well, I think we need some guidance on this. I thought the point was to use a measurement technique that Northwest would think is
right.
adequate, not whether I think it's adequate or not.
Yeah, and this is an interesting comment. We can, we don't have to spend all the time on learning outcomes because I'd like to move to something else. But Northwest also says that they expect us to be able to describe what we are, who we are, what we're trying to do, and then that should be evident through everything that they see. So in a sense, they kind of, if we say these are our aims, there's the aims of the BYU education, they probably expect to see some of those surface in the outcomes, and then how we decide to measure them. I can't speak for Northwest, and I don't really, frankly, care that much about Northwest. You know, I told someone the other day, if we write these outcomes for Northwest, they're not going to be very good, and they're not going to help us very much. If we write these outcomes to help us as faculty decide what we're trying to do and come to agreement about what our goals are, then they can help us, and then we can look at, yeah, you had one more.
Well, I would think it would matter not so much what we think, what they got out of it, but what they thought, the students. So ask the students.
Which is what, yeah, in both these cases they did. Yeah, they were asking them, you know, did this happen for you? We do it in you know, graduate surveys, the postgraduate surveys, where we say, tell us what happened in your BYU education and answer these questions, and we can, yeah.
I was just thinking that in some sense, I would like to see a kind of learning outcome where the students in some sense can relate what we talked about in this class to some gospel principle or some gospel truth. If they can't do that, we haven't really connected. I like the bookend kind of thing. And I'm reminded of a class that my wife and I took. It was about financing and retiring, one of these night classes. I think it was maybe Scott or something. I was amazed at the way he put that whole thing and the idea of being a good steward, managing your resources. You know, in the back of the mind was creating worlds and the whole thing. I mean, it was all there. And it gave you an excitement about a really boring subject. And I tell you, if somebody is teaching me about performance and so on, I want to hear how that connects to some gospel principle about what it is to be inspired in the moment and how your spirit works as you're. It seems like every class ought to have something like that. And those kind of things you ought to be able to measure.
So when Mike was talking about the therefore what,
oh, yes,
kind of
it's like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
When we were approaching an assessment for fine arts, we brought in a professional to help us coach through the process. And as we went through most of the steps that all of us have gone through, we had a faculty member who said, we know you're not from BYU, you may not understand religious connotations. How do we ask those kind of questions? How do we assess something like that? How do we write an outcome that's based on religious belief? And she didn't even hesitate. She said, why would you ask a question? She said, shouldn't it be the adjectives and all the other ones? She said, it shouldn't be a separate part of your life. It should be a part of everything you're doing.
Shouldn't be a separate outcome kind of thing.
Well, she just was puzzled that we would make it a separate thing. She said, why would you try to teach a student that it's just a little piece of their life? Shouldn't it be the adjectives in all of your life?
In everything.
Which I thought was a great
It's good.
Like an umbrella.
This umbrella, this thing that infiltrates everything we do. Yeah, Stephanie.
Well, I think one of the things you can do is that this is implicit, that these goals are implicit goals. They show up in a holistic way that people live their lives and are in relationship to other people.
Right.
And I know this is easier in education, and it's probably easier in business, but you can look at the capstone projects that you ask them to do this.
Right.
And you can think about if this person is becoming spiritually enlarged, then what would I expect to see in the language, in the planning, in whatever it is in that capstone project? Now, I think that's probably in philosophy or music performance or in other things. And I even think, you know, potentially even maybe given the kind of problem that you set up for that capstone project. That you, in my work I do research and I take up as research topics living contradictions, the places in my life where I'm living in opposition to what I say that I believe. And in order to collect data, I have to locate that data collection exactly in those places where it'll give me information that I'm not acting in the way that I say that I believe. And it seems to me that you could, I think that's a hard problem, but it's one that we could take up as we think about what those capstone projects are.
That's good. Thank you. There's one thing, and this brings it up, and Ross's comment about physics brings it up too. Multiple, even general authorities have said, don't force this integration. Don't try and make physics into a religious topic. if it doesn't lend itself. That's not what President Bateman, when he was president, mentioned this. Elder Oaks has mentioned this. So, yeah, there's nobody saying, let's change the nature of the discipline so that we can integrate the gospel. But here's the question that keeps bearing on me, and it comes from what Jim said earlier. If we actually do things differently, do we do things differently as a result of our faith? Now that relates more for me to pedagogy. In other words, methods, how we teach, not so much what we teach. Now, the how, the pedagogy things certainly come out in the relationship. We don't usually think of relationship with students as pedagogical, but it is pedagogical. And so when we learn people's names, and when we call them by name, and when we react kindly to them, this is all pedagogical. This is relationship stuff, as you're talking about. So the question is there an LDS pedagogy that we haven't talked enough about, and we don't know enough about, and we haven't thought enough about? We have all heard stories. Everybody in this room has heard stories that probably are disturbing to you, as they are to me, when a student says, this is what a faculty member said to me, this is how a faculty member treated me. And I think, actually, that should not happen here. And from time to time it does. And we say, so maybe we're not. That faculty member doesn't understand that this relationship thing, this pedagogical activity, this method that we use in teaching kind of overarches the content. I mean, it kind of goes beyond the content. Doesn't matter what we're teaching. This is why Jim Stice sometimes says, I always tell people, I am so glad that I teach accounting because it's so easy to integrate the gospel into this topic. You say, yes, you know, those ledgers. I mean, it's just, I can just see it right now, you know. But he said he came to, you know, BYU one day, and he was walking in the building, and he said, I thought, wait a minute. I'm teaching exactly the same as if I were up the street at another university. He said, what is that? That doesn't make sense. I shouldn't be teaching my topic exactly the same. Now, of course, he teaches accounting and the content of accounting, I think, just as well as anybody teaches accounting. But maybe he uses some different things in pedagogy that say to students, this is a man of faith, and I want to model after him. Just like you've really been talking about today. So, we have very little time left, is that right? A few minutes? We have a few minutes. So, would you just address this for a few minutes with me? Are there pedagogical things that we ought to really embrace here? And the first one is this relationship thing. And I think most of us agree we ought to not scowl at our students and distance ourselves from them and say, no, I'm not going to help you. I heard a student, he said, he went to get this paper from a faculty member. The faculty member said, oh, yeah, I didn't grade this paper yet, and wrote a C on the paper and gave it back before reading it, in a sense. And the student said, well, did you actually look at this? He said, I can just tell. Well, you know, is that good pedagogy? Or is that just plain malpractice of teaching? It's malpractice of teaching. It shouldn't be done anywhere, but certainly not on this campus, you know. So this is what I hope we go away thinking today, something about, are there things that I might do differently so that people can feel my faith because of the way I teach? Yeah. Well, let's, Arden, and then Stephanie.
Well, I'm grateful to have an opportunity to say something positive, because I had some strong feelings that sort of, well, now that we have to do with the assessment, so
Assessment always brings these feelings.
As I was hearing the panelists and I was thinking through it, there were some models that I thought were important, one of which is that we all need to remember the context of who we are, who they are, and in terms of eternal progression, we're really not very much further along than they are, and maybe not as far along. And therefore, there is a sense of fellow journeyman along the way and not a superior or arrogant position to an inferior individual. The second part of that, and that's just a simple, basic behavior pattern for all human beings. The second one is that I think that we need to really take at our very best values that our purposes are, in this earth are to exercise decision-making, agency, choice, and that presupposes that the professor sets up an environment where choice is possible, where there are options available, and that the student is empowered to make choices and to learn about choice making and consequence of choice making, so that as they leave a particular class, which they may remember or not, they will learn the process of learning. And that lifetime learning thing really begins with the whole respect for the fact that life is all about making choices, and we could really help them by setting up that.
Thank you. How many more have comments? We've got a number of people, so just quick, if you could. Yeah.
I was just going to talk about how it's always important to go humble.
Oh, good. So same kind of thing. It's always important for you to be humble, a learner, fellow learner. Okay? Yes?
I sort of started an experiment 2 semesters ago. I didn't do it this past semester, but I'm going to try it again. I sort of started what I call Contact Your Classmate project. It's sort of kind of like modeled on the home teaching, visiting teaching. I sort of assigned 2 students, and each pair would take care of 2 students, and they sort of report to me via email every 3 weeks. Basically check on their progress of their classmates to see if there's any.
Do they remember to home teach? That's what I.
and I have reasonable feedback. It's sort of it needs to be time consuming since reading through the comments. I thought it would, but one comment I like is sort of I didn't think I did that, but they said I care about the students. Okay,
and in a sense, you conveyed that care through peer help. Is that correct? Yeah, yeah. This is an interesting. This is a pedagogy. I mean, this peer help is a pedagogy. You know, this is really interesting. Very good. Somebody else had one. Yes, Brian.
One of the things I admire about the faculty here on campus is the huge amount of reverence they have for their discipline. There's this blend of knowledge and reverence. And when I see them try to pull that reverence out of their students, find that little chunks of opportunity, say, okay, here you learned this, but isn't it great, kind of thing. You get that aesthetic experience. Even if you don't mention the spirit in that, it does expand the testimony in a profound way. And I think that can really happen if you can assess that in ways.
Thank you. Coming back to this comment about having faith in your students and seeing their potential that came earlier from the panel. If I asked all of you, who is the most influential, one of the most influential teachers you can think of growing up, whatever age, the most common response that would come from you is, this teacher expressed so much confidence in me that I could do something I did not think I could do. This is the most common response that comes when we do in faculty seminars or whatever. So really this is, in a sense, a pedagogy. It is expressing faith in that learner that they can do something they did not think possible. It's a powerful, powerful pedagogy. Great teachers do this all the time. Somebody else had a comment. Yes?
Just on that same idea, I think that we can be a great influence on our students in the way we respond to them and respond to their learning efforts. Obviously, we need to be rigorous and teach them analytical skills, but we can do that with the spirit of respect, and especially as, you know, and I'm a writing expert, I guess, but as we respond to their writing assignments, I think it's really important to take the time to respond respectfully to their ideas and to encourage them in developing better skills and not be disrespectful in the way we respond.
Thank you. One of my sons did a PhD, and he worked quite a bit with an educational philosopher, and I watched his writing improve, and he told me about how that professor gave him feedback on writing. It was so impressive to me. And it was respectful, but it was honest. And so one of the first papers he said, this is basically pretty much off the mark. You need to start over, and let me give you some hints. And he had him start over. But so right there all the time, but rigorous, but respectful, both, yeah. Well, I think, yes.
I do think that all of our mentoring efforts here at BYU to get students to work on professional level projects, that is a way of expecting tons out of them. This is not just for the class. This has got to go for a journal article. It's got to go for storyboarding for this film, whatever, you know.
Yes,
it really
absolutely.
requires a ton.
It's going to be real. It's not just an assignment, not just something you're doing so that I can read as a professor, but something that's going to go out there.
And you guys can do it.
And you guys can do it, yeah. Very empowering. Thank you very much. This has been very enlightening for me, very helpful. Thank you to our panelists. Excellent, excellent dissertation.